Hello and welcome to the St. Andrew's Society of Los Angeles podcast. Each episode will bring you the latest news from the St. Andrew's Society of Los Angeles, as well as fascinating interviews with entertainment personalities, government leaders, and community advocates. St. Andrew's Society of Los Angeles, where Scotland meets the City of Angels. Let's get started. Our co-host today is Sean Lettingham, who sits on the board of St. Andrew's Society of Los Angeles. Sean is a trial attorney who specializes in civil litigation. Mr. Lettingham has a deep love for Scottish history, especially learning about underrepresented voices in Scotland. Our guest today is BAFTA award-winning director Parisa Urquhart, who has produced and directed numerous films such as Scotland, Slavery and Statues, Long Live Livy, and her documentary on American abolitionist Frederick Douglas, whose visit to Scotland is the focal point of her film Strike for Freedom. Parisa's passion for filmmaking led her to start Urquhart Media Limited, enabling her to produce and direct her own projects. We find out more about Parisa's current projects and what's on the horizon for her in this insightful interview. Please welcome director, producer, Parisa Urquhart.
Welcome, Parisa. You are a BAFTA-winning filmmaker. And so I'd like to ask first, for you, what has been the most difficult part of directing and producing your own films? What has been the easiest? What have you enjoyed the most? And what is the part that you really could live without?
Yeah, well, thanks, first of all, for having me on this podcast. I really appreciate it. It's great to connect with everyone in the US and in LA. So, as a documentary maker, I mean, it's very much something that is, it takes time to get into the role and really understand what's involved, especially if you've not worked through the different ranks within the industry, which I haven't, because I started to get involved in this area much later in my career. So I would say that the difficult part is to try and convince commissioners that the story that you want to convey, because it's a documentary and you don't really know what the outcome's going to be, the story you want to convey is going to have a really interesting focus and direction, and something's going to come out of it. Commissioners really have to have a level of trust in you, and also have a level of trust in the subject, and understand that it's an important subject. So in the area that I focus in on, which is identity, belonging, colonization, and then we're specifically Scotland's links to slavery and the slave trade, it was hard to get commissions in this at first. But also because I was an emerging documentary maker at the time when I first started in this area, which was about 6-7 years ago. And so I kept persisting without, a commission for a long documentary, but I did manage to get a short documentary for the Scotland, Slavery and Statues, which is one about Scotland's links to slavery and the slave trade. And that kept me going. But I had to, what's difficult is, I had to keep convincing the commissioner, and eventually I got a commission after 3-4 years of having communication with a commissioner about this subject. And unfortunately, it was after the tragic murder of George Floyd. So it's really, it seems like with the stuff I'm doing, it's in a sense ahead of the curve. And that's what you want as a documentary maker. You want to be ahead of the curve, but it's trying to convince the commissioners that you're also ahead of the curve, and for them to trust in you. Do you know what? There's not many things that are easy within documentary making. So the easiest part, I would say, is after it's been announced that you've won an award, the easiest part is walking up on that podium and accepting the awards. Because everything before that is really quite hard.
Something tells me that may be one of the best parts as well.
I think you're actually getting acknowledgement and recognition within the industry, and that's really, really important, especially with documentary making, because the main thing with documentaries is you're trying to get across the voice of the main contributors. And so when that documentary comes out, it's the contributors that get the coverage in the newspapers and in television, news, and so forth, which is the important thing. But actually, what then happens is no one really knows who, worked for 5, 6 years in the background trying to make it happen. So when you actually get awards within the industry, that it's just really, really important, and it makes it worthwhile.
You mentioned the role of commissioners and securing the commission to do a documentary. For those of us in the States and not in the industry, what does that entail? What goes into starting a new project?
Different people are in different positions with regard to this. I'm lucky in the sense that I'm an independent documentary maker. So I'm focusing in on stories that I'm passionate about, that I think are important. Whereas if you were part of a larger production company, you're oftentimes going with the guidance of what the commissioners are saying they want, because then it's more likelihood you'll get a commission. So in my case, what I would be doing is I would be, coming up with ideas that I find are really important to me, and then I'd be preparing a summary of that, and then I'd be approaching the commissioners with a brief email and saying, listen, this is my idea. Are you interested in principle? And they'll either say, actually, no, because we've already commissioned something in that area, or they'll say, yes, we're interested, and why don't you submit a longer treatment document outlining your idea? Also, they quite like to have to see some footage, but depending on the channel, you can ask for development money to cover the costs of taking footage. A lot of the time, though, you actually just need to spend that money in advance and just get the footage in advance. And a lot of the time as well, as an independent documentary maker, you need to spend quite a bit of time, even before you do that summary, really ensuring that there is a bit of a story in it. But on the whole, that is the process with the commissioner. And the commissioner will then go through your treatment doc and look at the footage you've taken and then say, okay, yeah, we're interested in this. And then the next stage is really, starting all the contractual paperwork, financing, budgeting, and working out what realistically you can do within the budget you're being offered. And if you're not being offered enough budgets, then either you limit what you're able to do, or you go to other organizations like Screen Scotland, Doc Society, and so forth, and see if they'll be open to offering further funding. So you can, for example, have a really good sound design for your documentary, or you want animation, things like this that cost quite a bit of money that the TV channels maybe just can't really afford. So that's what happens.
I've got a quick question for you, especially in speaking about commissioners. Has there ever been a time where you said, hey, I want to do this documentary on this particular subject, and they said, fine, can you slant it a certain way?
No.
Oh, okay. That's good to know.
Yeah.
There's always, as somebody who watches documentaries, there's always this moment where it's like, has this all been slanted in a direction to tell this particular story or not?
Yeah. Like I say, I'm still an emerging documentary maker. I've done 2 long documentaries for BBC. I've worked with Channel 4 News, and then I've done short ones cinematically that are fully independent. What I would say is the key criteria is for BBC is impartiality. So you have to convey both sides of the story. and it has to be, in a sense, absolutely balanced and equal. So if one person on one side of the story says X, Y, and Z, and they've got X amount of time on screen and things like this, you need to balance it out with, well, what does the other person think about this that's also key in the story? And so that both views are conveyed. So it's very much like that. It's not that well, certainly from my experience, they've not said we're not keen for you to say this or that. Yeah.
Is it ever frustrating as a filmmaker to feel like you have to present both sides if, for example, you feel pretty strongly that one side in this debate is the correct side?
Yeah, I mean, there's a skill in it, and also there's as a documentary maker, you need to have an awareness of it. I think at the end of the day, and I think if viewers watch my documentary Scotland, Slavery and Statues, where it was a 1 hour for BBC, and it absolutely, because of the subject, it had to be impartial. I think what the viewer will find is that when both sides are conveyed, and when one side is conveyed, and also as part of that, aspects of what has been done with regard to that side, so fake social media accounts and things like this, it's up to the viewer to make their decision, but all the facts are there, and they can choose what they are happy with and what they're not happy with. At the end of the day, I think with documentaries, when you show both sides, and certainly with this documentary, you start realizing the barriers, the obstacles, everything that's put into the place of the key person in the documentary. So Jeff Palmer, in this case, who was trying to change the wording on the statue of Henry Dundas to say that he had delayed the abolition of the slave trade. What you'll see is he's up against a lot, and he's up against it in various different ways with regard to social media, but also other ways that kind of thwart his attempts. So I think it's all there, and the viewers can decide what their view is, but nothing is, in a sense, being hidden because it's something that documentary thinks, I don't agree with that, or I don't believe in that. You just can't do that. It would be a very different type of documentary if it was like that. It was more of a polemic and so forth. And some channels do support that, and you can see that with certain presenters. But it's it's a big choice that documentary makers decide to go down, if they go that route or they go the other route.
So in that film, Scotland, Slavery and Statues, you confront the very difficult issue of how a community today reckons with some of the conduct, and in that film, the role of a Scottish statesman in perpetuating or delaying the abolition of slavery, and in particular in Scotland, which is a nation that very much prides itself and markets itself on its history. I would imagine it's difficult to explore the less attractive, less romantic aspects of the nation's history. What difficulties did you find in trying to bring that story to your audience?
Well, I think it's all about timing, and it's all about, in a sense, the zeitgeist that's going on in a country. I found it difficult getting that across before the summer of 2020 with the murder of George Floyd. It was seen as a more niche area, even though it is Scottish history. It was seen more as, Black history within Scotland, and it's not. Whereas after the murder of George Floyd, and there was a spotlight on the Black Lives Movement that had been going on for, as we know, for a long time, there was this understanding, realization that this history is Scottish history. It shouldn't be separated out. So it was easier then, and that's when I got the commission. So it's really about, gauging the zeitgeist in a sense and working out when is this going to be picked up and when it's not. But I have to say, I was, at the end of the day, when you feel that a subject or a story needs to be told, you got to tell it at that time. And what was happening in Scotland before that for about 7-8 years, since the Commonwealth Games especially, that happened in Scotland in 2014, there was much more of an academic movement to convey this history. More academic papers and books were coming out. So I think it was about getting it to initially channels that had more of a diverse slant. So I managed to get commission with Channel 4 News because they have a remit of trying to convey stories from more diverse backgrounds. So and that really helped. Even though it was a 5-minute story in their Channel News show, it at least promoted, in a sense, what was going on in Edinburgh to the wider audience, and it gave the story a status that it didn't have before, and it gave me funding so I could at least get initial filming done. And then they agreed to a follow-up story during the summer of 2020. So that also helped with more funding, and then eventually I got the commission. So that's what happened with that. So yeah.
So maybe taking a step back, at what point in your life did you decide that you wanted to go into filmmaking? And then I think you'd mentioned that the move to documentary filmmaking is a relatively recent development. What prompted that change?
Yeah, it's interesting. The thing with filmmaking is it's seen as quite a risky area to go into, I would say, especially if you're in your early 20s, you're a university student, and your parents are saying, well, wait a second, you really need to earn money. You need to have, a good foundation, especially if we've paid all that money to put you through university. Yeah. So
I will say one of the most unifying and global human traits is parents wanting to make sure that their kids go into a good profession that makes money.
Exactly. Okay. Documentary making is not one of them. That we've got to acknowledge that, except when you get to a certain point in your career. But so when I turned around to my mum when I was 20, I was a mature student actually by that time. I think it was about 24, and I said, right, I really want to do a master's in documentary making. She was like, no. and I was like, really? And she was thinking, well, why on earth are you not moving down to the city, of London, and the finance sector, and getting a job as an economist, or as in the finance industry, because I'd studied economics as well as English literature. So so anyway, that was a bit of a disappointment, to put it mildly. And I then just went on a completely different trajectory, where I did go and work as an economist in the Treasury, HM Treasury in London. And then I moved into the property industry after that. And I did various things and was an entrepreneur running property companies. But actually, when I actually decided to reassess what I was doing, because I was getting extremely bored, an opportunity came up when I was living abroad to make a short film for ABC, Australian Broadcasting Corporation. And so I went on that course, and it was only, to make a 2-minute film. But that course actually reignited my enthusiasm for making documentaries. And it really wasn't something I'd thought about for about 20 years. It really been put into the back burner. But when that happened, when I did that short film, I thought, this is what I want to do. And so that then put me on a path of going to do a diploma in Sydney in a film school there. And then after that, I moved back to Scotland with the mission of making documentaries, exposing, highlighting Scotland's links to the slave trade, slavery, and colonialism, because of the experiences of seeing how difficult the culture was in Australia because of British colonialism, and also India when I was there for a period of time and so forth. So I kind of knew Scotland needs to face up to its history as well.
So your film, Strike for Freedom, Frederick Douglass in Scotland, discusses Frederick Douglass's impact on Scotland and Scotland's impact on Frederick Douglass. How did visiting Scotland affect his work towards the abolition of slavery?
Because that's quite a big question, and I was thinking about it, and and it's great that in the US everyone knows about Frederick Douglass, because in the UK people really don't know about Frederick Douglass, and they really didn't know much about Frederick Douglass before he arrived in the UK in 1846. But there have been lots of African American abolitionists that traveled over to the UK over a massive span of time. There had been a lot of speeches and so forth trying to push for the end of slavery in the US, and obviously before that slavery in the UK and slave trade in the UK. So, but what the difference was, I think, when Frederick Douglass came to Scotland was that he was appointed an anti-slavery agent. And he was such an amazing orator that when he was traveling around the UK and especially Scotland, I mean, he did approximately 70 speeches throughout Scotland in his time. He was in Scotland for 6 months. And then he also did speeches in England and Ireland and so on. He was really courageous in what he said, and he was very good at speaking. And he was very, very good at bringing the audience in to the subjects and the topics he was talking about. He created a bit of a balance. There was other African American abolitionists like Josiah Henson and so on had come previous, and they didn't really have as much of a knack. But it was simply because they were trying to say the truth of what was going on and what he experienced and so on. And it was quite, it was blatantly quite, tough for audiences to listen to. And it was important for him to listen to that stuff. I think with Douglass, when he came and he spoke, he just kind of managed the crowds and so forth in a certain way that it brought people into what was going on and brought them on a journey that they were, committed to. They got committed to. And what happened was he seemed a very personable person, and he connected with a lot of people who were abolitionists in the UK. He built up very good relationships with them. And what he was like, the connection between what was going on in the UK and what was going on in the US. And he solidified a lot of what was happening already. So, for example, like Jane and Eliza Wigham, who, had set up and run Edinburgh and Glasgow Ladies Emancipation Societies, who were raising funds to then send over to abolitionists in the US for the Underground Railroad and for speeches and all this. He was building up even stronger relationships with them. He was connecting them up to even more abolitionists. His wife, as we know, Anna Murray, was very close to the activities of Harriet Tubman and so forth. And there was all these connections were starting to be made. And so I just think his presence throughout that period of time really connected Scotland and the US and the activities that were going on. And the other thing that he was very good at was really calling out institutions that were going over to the US and trying to raise money, like the Free Church of Scotland. You know, they had the audacity to travel over to the US and raise money from Scottish slaveholders over there to set up churches in Scotland. You know, and he called that out. He'd go into the churches in Scotland and he'd say, "Come on, you've got to send back that money. That is not, in a sense, good money. You know, it's bloodstained money." So, you know, he was quite courageous with all of that, and you know, of course, he experienced a lot of backlash, but he kept going. He kept pursuing it. And that was really important. And he became, like I've said in my film, he did become the hero of the move towards abolishing slavery in the US. So he had a massive impact in Scotland.
There's something that you said earlier during this interview, that things like the slave trade and stuff was not really seen as Scottish history, but as Black history. And then as the George Floyd murder happened, it was kind of like a wake-up call. But can you maybe guess or venture a guess as to why there was that separation, as like, hey, we're not really a part of this?
Yeah, sure. I mean, this is my opinion. Yeah, I'm not an academic. You know, I just observe what's going on, and I've experienced growing up in Scotland as part of the education system in Scotland. But I would say two things about this. I would say, for a start, for Black British people, of course, they believe this history is British history, Scottish history. It's not just Black history. It should be taught throughout the year. There should be programs about it throughout the year, not just in Black History Month. For I would say, in the mainstream education system and amongst the institutions and so forth, I've really observed, you know, before 2020, that this was a separate history, and it's not part of mainstream history, in a sense. That is, yeah, it's just not simply seen as Scottish history. You know, it's like Scottish Black history. And it's like, well, wait a second here. It wasn't just Black people involved in this. Actually, there was a lot of Scottish people involved in this, and all sorts of social classes and so forth. So this is Scottish history. So anyway, but what I would say as well is, growing up in the educational system, what was happening, and also looking at the websites and booklets and so forth of estates throughout Scotland when they're talking about their history, what was happening was, up to quite recently, when things were discussed, such as plantation owners, slave traders, traders in tobacco, cotton, and so forth, sugar, all these sorts of people that were referred to, and when we were taught about them, they were referred to as either merchants, successful entrepreneurs, inspirational people who, you know, were the bedrock of Glasgow, Edinburgh, and so forth. They created the wealth in these cities. They were revered. When you would look at websites of estates, the owners and so forth were certainly not referred to as slave plantation owners, as, you know, where they got their wealth from. They were referred to more as, you know, merchants, successful people as well. You know, there are other words that basically did not link their activities to the fact that they were using slave labor or they were owning slave plantations. It was just all hidden. And some people say it's deliberately hidden. Other people say it was amnesia. Other people say, oh, well, so many people within society actually didn't know the history because it wasn't being taught. So they were using these words out of ignorance. So there's the views, but certainly, like I mentioned, over the past 10 years, and certainly after the summer of 2020, there's been a real wake-up call saying, come on, we've got to be honest about the words that are being used here, and we've got to acknowledge this history. People don't need to feel guilty about it or ashamed about it. I mean, if they do, they do, and they can feel whatever they feel, but at the end of the day, it's got to be acknowledged and and be part of Scottish history.
For you personally, what inspired you to focus so much of your career on this issue, even before the cultural lens shifted in 2020 and others started paying attention? You've mentioned that you were involved. You actually did your first piece on the statues in Edinburgh before that moment. What brought you into this area of filmmaking?
Yeah, I mean, I think, how I mentioned, I lived in Australia for about 7 years, and previous to that, I lived for much shorter period of time. I spent time in India. Also, I'm half Iranian, so I know about colonialism and the effect it can have in other countries, the British impact in Iran, and also as well, my family are very much darker skin than me. They're full Iranian. I'm Iranian and Scottish. So I kind of like exist in two worlds of where I'm like kind of seen as white, not completely white, but I'm often asked where I'm from. But my other family members are definitely, they experience racism. So, I come from a background of all these things. And basically, I think, though, the main thing was being in Australia, living there with a white Australian, and starting to experience really the problems within culture over there because of British colonialism, the impact it had, and the fact that these problems weren't properly being dealt with because the proper true history of what went on wasn't being taught. So it wasn't being taught at the schools, certainly not for the generations from maybe about 30 years old upwards. So more was being taught in schools for the younger generation when I was there, which was great. So there was more awareness happening. And then during the time when I was there was a production company that was set up, fully run by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and they were able to tell their stories from their perspective. And they were being shown on ABC as well as SBS, so the mainstream broadcast channels. And that was a big deal because they were really starting to expose the truth about what had happened from their point of view. But, this is like in, between 2008 and 2014. I mean, it's not long ago. And so what I really started realizing was this is the problem, is when this history is not taught from the point of view of people who've been oppressed, then people don't really get it. They don't understand the problems that are occurring within society. So that's what made me think, right, the truth needs to come out within Scotland about its links with slavery, colonization. Scotland hasn't been victimized in these areas. They've been the aggressors in these areas, and they need to accept that. And then it means that they can then understand the calls from people, Black British people who've been, campaigning for many years to have this true history told. So yeah, that's how I came about it.
In keeping up with kind of current events, there's been this huge surge of protest by the people of Iran, which is pretty much turned into a revolt at this point, in reaction to the killing of a young woman accused of not following Iran's hijab law. What hopes or expectations do you have that the protests may lead to human rights change for the Iranian people?
Well, first of all, what I think viewers would like to know, if they're not Iranian, they don't know much about Iran, is that there was a Persian Empire that started about, just over 3,000 years ago, and the main basis of the Persian Empire was Zoroastrianism. And that is, it was the first monotheistic religion in the world. And it had the basis of tolerance and equality. And so when King Cyrus was leading the empire, he was the one that created what's argued as the first Declaration of Human Rights. And it was engraved in a cylinder, and the original cylinder is in the British Museum. And a copy has been made and has been put in front of the headquarters of the United Nations building in New York. And that declaration states that there should be absolute and utter tolerance for people of all different religions to practice their religions in society, and their culture, and genders, the equality in genders. So that actually was what it was like within the Persian Empire, like over 3,000 years ago. And when it came to women, there was absolute equality between men and women. So for women, for thousands of years, women were really active within society. They had positions of power. They, had financial independence. They were able to run their own businesses. They kept their own name when they married, and they could choose the husbands they wanted to be married to. They were very well educated, and there was equality. So it's basically equality in home life, but equality in public life. So that is what Iranian women are used to. This is the foundation. This is the basis of what has been their life for generations back, and this is the foundation and basis of Iranian heritage and culture. So it's not that Iranian women are fighting for something that's new to them. They're trying to get all their rights back that they've had for thousands of years. And this is way before Islam came into Iran. So I think it's a really important point to make. And my family are all Zoroastrian. And so we're from that culture and that culture of equality. So, I mean, from my personal point of view, when I'm looking at what's going on in Iran, I feel, real pride towards the women there, because it's really, really scary what they're going through and dangerous what they're going through. But it's amazing what they're doing. And I think it's just brilliant that they are really they've come together and stood up. And it's brilliant that Iranian men are really, really supporting them this time, because there's been times in the past where, from what I've heard, there's not been as much support from men with regard to women trying to fight for their freedoms, because men have got far more freedoms in Iran than women, as we know. So it's still not tolerable for them, but it's, a bit more bearable to live in a society like that. So anyway, it's great for the women to get that support, and for women to get support throughout the world, because we're all realizing, like us in Scotland, we're trying to be the voice of these Iranian women. We're trying to do stuff here. And it's, in my personal point of view, as a woman, like, I understand where they're coming from. Whatever society you live in, you want your basic human rights, and these basic human rights are not being respected whatsoever, and they need to have basic human rights. So my personal hope is they get these basic human rights.
Before we started recording, we had talked about the World Cup and the response that happened the morning that we are filming this, or the evening before, about during the national anthem, how there was kind of this solemn moment and in a show of kind of solidarity towards the women, or at least it was seen that way. What were your thoughts on that as well?
Yeah, my thoughts on it are, at the end of the day, it's great, I have to say, that they are supporting the women by, not singing the anthem. I mean, they've stated, this is based on the newspaper articles I've read. So I'm observing this and picking this up from newspaper articles. They didn't sing the national anthem because they support the women's movement for basic human rights. So if that is the basis of the reason that they're not singing the national anthem, then I understand that and support that, because women deserve their human rights. So what they've done has garnered media attention, and who knows how things will go when they go back to Iran.
Parisa, looking forward, can you tell us about any future projects that you're working on?
Yeah, sure. So I actually, believe it or not, I was starting to do a documentary on the previous Iranian Revolution. But from a very personal point of view, it's really more about identity and belonging as a Scottish Iranian, and how things like revolutions can really affect people's lives in massively big ways. For example, my extended family had to all split and go to different countries, and we had to try and start again. And there was a lot, certainly for me in Scotland, there was a lot of isolation at that time. Very minimal amount of people were Iranians in Scotland, and people didn't really get it, that what it's like fleeing one country and going to another one. So I was starting to do a documentary on that, about identity and belonging as a woman. What I'm doing now is incorporating what's going on now, because there's a lot of women in Scotland who are now supporting the movement of women in Iran, but they're also talking about the issue of identity and belonging raising up for them again. Within their day-to-day life, they would say they push it to the side because they've got to get on with life, but it's all now starting to come up within their lives now. So I'm capturing that to bring that into the documentary, to highlight the importance of being able to be free to go to the different cultures that you're from. Freedom to go, like, let's say I want freedom to be able to go back to Iran without fear. Because even the last time I went, I was stopped by the morality police, and they were pretty violent about it, verbally, not physically. So, we all have our rights that we think we should, absolutely have, and that's freedom to go between the cultures that we're from. So anyway, so that documentary is ongoing at the moment, and I'm just trying to get it commissioned, and I'm hoping as well it'll be something that the US will be interested in watching in the future, to get that different perspective, the Scottish perspective on this area. And then what I also want to do is a 1-hour documentary on Frederick Douglas, or maybe a 3-part series, because he had a big impact in Scotland, as we know, and that deserves a 1-hour documentary. He also had a big impact in England and in Ireland. So I thought of a 3-part series covering those areas that could also be screened in the US. So I want to do that. And then I've also been very keen to do a documentary about the move for reparations in Britain with regard to slavery and the slave trade, but it's been hard to get a commission on that. So it's stalled at the moment, unfortunately. But maybe there'll be appetite for it. Who knows? But if there's anyone who's listening to this podcast who is interested in getting involved and helping with topics like this with regard to sponsorship or in other ways, please get in touch. And also as well, the British Embassy have contacted me saying it'd be really good to do a British tour. A film tour around the US and Canada of Frederick Douglas in Scotland and Scotland Slavery and Statues. So if there's anyone who's listening who wants to sponsor that in any sort of way, I would love to hear from you, because I think it'd be really amazing to do a film tour, and then it means it'll be picked up by others who want to screen it in the US and Canada, which is the main aim.
And I mean, certainly those are subject matters that touch deeply on our history here in the United States, and some of the darkest chapters of our history, and things that we are also still trying to reckon with as a community.
Yeah, yes. But also as well, the Frederick Douglass film, well, I would say both films, it's about this dark history, like you say, but also it's very inspirational. Like when you see the Frederick Douglass film, you see how amazing he was in galvanizing so much support, amazing he was as a person, and courageous he was. It's very inspiring. A lot of people watch that film are inspired to be activists today, because they see that it's a generational thing. And then in the Scotland Slavery and Statues film, I would argue that Sir Geoff Palmer is, in a sense, the new Frederick Douglass of Scotland, because he is the modern day orator that has really galvanized people and made change in Scotland and in Britain as a whole. So it's these films are really inspirational and really show how activists, they have to go through obstacles and everything, but they can actually make people understand where they're coming from eventually, and change can be made. So it's, for people, I think for listeners who are thinking, I don't really want to watch films like this because they'll depress me, actually it'll be the opposite. They'll inspire you.
When you were talking about Frederick Douglass earlier, and how one of the reasons he was more successful in getting audiences in Scotland than some of his predecessors who had come before, was the fact that he knew his audience, and he knew that it was, you couldn't just go in and disclose the terrible tragedies that were going on, but also bring a message of hope or inspiration. It almost sounded like Frederick Douglass was a documentarian, coming out there with a very important story to tell, but also had to know how to sort of move his audiences in the appropriate way.
Yeah, definitely. I agree with that. He seems to be a bit of an artist as well. He's got all sorts of aspects to him. And yeah, who knows what he would have done now in the age of film. But certainly at that time, as we all know, he was very well documented through photographs. But yeah, no film at that point. So yeah, who knows?
One final question here. What would you like to tell our viewers as to why it's important to promote and support Scottish films and filmmakers and filmmaking?
Well, I would say that a lot of documentaries that are being made at the moment in Scotland have a lot of resonance with people in the US and Canada. Well, as we know, there's that link going way back between a lot of people with white Scottish heritage that were evicted during the clearances in Scotland and went over to the US and Canada. But then also there's that, like I've mentioned, other links, two-way links, of African Americans that have come over, Native Americans that have come over, all sorts that have gone back and forth between the two countries. And what Scottish documentary makers are doing, they're telling these stories And these stories really resonate in the US and Canada. And so it's just super important to support us, because if we get as much coverage as we can, then the distributors will understand, okay, we will have an audience in the US if we bring your film to the US and Canada. So we need known, we need like our names known. We need to be our films need to be shown and so forth. Like what you're doing with your podcast is highlighting what I'm doing in my area, and if others can highlight what other filmmakers are doing, then hopefully we can get these stories told in the US and Canada as well. There are organizations here like the Scottish Documentary Institute that are really good at helping documentaries in their careers and getting them to the point where they're able to make longer documentaries. So they start short and they do offer grants for 10-minute documentaries, and then half hours, and then you get to the point where you can get commissions for 1 hour and so on with the broadcasters and so on. So these institutions are really important. Screen Scotland tries to get Scottish filmmakers known abroad, so I'm hoping they'll get on board with this film tour in the US and Canada and so forth. So, but anything anyone could do in the US and Canada to get our names well known there, so that distributors, cinemas, universities and so on can screen our films, we would appreciate it a lot.
Well, Parisa, I really want to, on behalf of the Society and myself, thank you for taking this time. Your films were truly a delight to watch. It was really inspirational for me to see that some of these struggles and issues that we're confronting in the States are issues that our brothers across the Atlantic are confronting as well. So I really appreciate the work you're doing and look forward to seeing more.
Yeah, thanks so much. Well, I really appreciate you going to the effort of setting up this podcast. I mean, it's really important for the work I'm doing to be known by people in the US, and hopefully they'll get to see it. I'm trying my best at the moment to get it onto screens in the US and Canada. I've got some interest, but I'm just pushing to try and get it out there. So fingers crossed. And I know you'll probably be sharing my website link, but if it's possible just to mention it on the podcast. So my surname is Urquhart. It's of the Urquhart clan, that the castle looks over Loch Ness in Scotland, where the Loch Ness monster lives. So my company is called Urquhart Media. And so my website is urquhartmedia.com. It's hard to spell Urquhart. So hopefully it'll be printed online as part of the podcast, but also on social media. I'm very active on Twitter, and it's at Urquhart Media. But then on Instagram and Facebook, it's Parisa Urquhart. So that gives updates on what's going on, not only with my documentaries, but other people's documentaries, and also about slavery and the slave trade. There are other Facebook pages I've set up. Scotland and the Slave Trade is set up, and Frederick Douglas in Scotland.com and Scotland Slavery and Statutes.com. So you could click on these links to see what's actually going on in Scotland with regard to these areas. That's great. And can I just show you one final image that I can change in the background? It is, right, let me see. This is a street in Edinburgh, Gilmore Place, where Frederick Douglas lived when he was in Scotland for 6 months. And after the film came out and there was more coverage of Frederick Douglass, a local artist called Trench he went up there and he found a spot on the street and he painted this mural of Frederick Douglass. Wow. It's so important, and it's created such an impact in the city. So I just wanted to show it to you.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the St. Andrews Society of Los Angeles podcast. For more information on the St. Andrews Society of Los Angeles, visit www.standrewsla.org. And don't forget to like our Facebook page, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube channels as well. Have a great week, and we'll see you next episode.